Good morning, Dr. Foster. Now, you are talking not just to the audience that you see in front of you. The size is limited for obvious reasons of the current, infection, although precautions generally may be easing. We take a very careful line here. But in particular, there will be a lot of people who are watching what you have to say online. The proceedings are being live streamed, so bear that in mind when you give your evidence. Thank you for being with us. In a moment, Katrina will ask you to take the affirmation. Katrina.
Could you please state your full name?
Peter Reynolds Foster.
Could you please repeat after me? I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare.
I do solemnly and sincerely, truly declare.
And affirm that affirm that the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Ms. Richards.
Dr. Foster, I'm just going to start with a very quick overview of your career. Now, you're a doctor but not a clinician. Your degree, as I understand it, is in chemical engineering with a PhD in biochemical engineering. Is that right?
That's correct.
In January 1973, you took up a post at the PFC as a senior biochemist, a post which you remained in until April 1974 before becoming the head of research and development at the PFC. Is that right?
Correct.
And I think your job title changed from time to time, but is it right to understand that that's essentially the role you continued to occupy throughout the lifetime of the PFC?
That's correct.
And was that until then 2008?
Yes.
Was that the point at which the PFC ceased to operate?
That's right.
For anyone's note, there's a CV for Dr. Foster. I'm not going to go to it, but it's at WITN 6914002. So you were not yourself involved with the treatment of patients, is that correct?
That's correct. I had no role in that at all because I'm not medically qualified.
And there's a part of your evidence, oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry, we can look at it if necessary, but I don't think we need to, in which you explained that you'd never worked in a blood bank and you didn't have practical experience of using cryoprecipitate.
That's correct.
Now, you've given evidence on a number of different occasions in a number of different forums, and I'm just going to go through those briefly. You gave evidence in multi-district litigation in the States. Perhaps we can take this from your witness statement. Sally, could we have on screen WITN 6914001? And if we go to page 15, and we can see bottom half of the page, you explain there your involvement at the request of lawyers from the United States in the MDL, multi-district litigation 986 in the States. You say over the page, if we go to page 16, and it's the 5th paragraph, so Roman numerals 8, you refer to your trial testimony being filmed in Edinburgh on the 8th of December 1997, and you say you believed it was shown at a number of court hearings, all of which found in favour of the defendants. What's the source of your understanding, Dr. Foster, that the litigation to which you refer was found in favour of the defendants?
That is what I was told by the lead attorney for the defendants when I asked him what had happened to my evidence.
I mention it, and Sarah, I make an observation for wider purposes because it's been drawn to my attention that there is evidence of a number of claims within MDL 986 multi-district litigation being subject to settlement and subject to the payment of sums to the plaintiffs. So I was asked to clarify that with you.
Yes, my understanding was that the case, the claims, at least those that were permitted to proceed in the United States, were settled.
Yes.
For what were considered substantial sums,
Yes.
I think.
That's certainly the evidence we've seen.
Can I just comment?
Yes,
that
of
what
course.
I was told was that settlement was a kind of out-of-court settlement.
Yes.
But a number of the claimants declined that because they wanted their day in court. And so there were some further cases that were heard, and that's where my evidence was presented.
You explain in the next paragraph on the screen, so it's paragraph with Roman numerals 9, that you were asked to comment on an expert report from Dr. Nicholas Jewell concerning HIV infections in the UK. Now, I'm not going to go to the content of it, so I just really want to ask about how you came to be asked to do that. Dr. Jewell, now Professor Jewell, is a Professor of, I think, biostatistics and epidemiology. In fact, I should say he's on the inquiry's expert group in relation to statistics. You're obviously, as we've discussed, you're a clinical scientist, you're a chemist by background. You're not a statistician or epidemiologist. How was it that you came to be asked to provide that report?
I can't really answer that, other than Mr. Barr contacted me and gave me a copy of this and asked for some comments on it.
And we can take that down, thank you. Now, you were also involved in providing evidence for the purposes of an investigation by the Scottish Executive and the Health and Community Care Committee of the Scottish Parliament, and that was in around 2000.
That's correct.
I'm just going to read the references for those reports. I'm not going to take you to them, but just so that others can find them readily. PRSE 40131, PRSE 301249, WITN 69140012 and WITN 69140013. Now, you also gave evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal in Ireland. How did that come about?
I have a vague memory that a solicitor from the Lindsay Tribunal came to Scotland to have preliminary discussions, and in advance of that, I had gone through the file that we had on Ireland, and I'd come across some correspondence between the director from the Republic of Ireland to Mr. Watt. Sorry, it's the other way around, from Mr. Watt to the director of the, I think, Dr. Reardon in Ireland, where Mr. Watt was suggesting that Irish plasma could be processed at PFC. And I thought that might be of interest to the Lindsay Tribunal. So that basically is what started them asking me to give evidence. And I can't really remember much about it other than what is now in the transcript of their proceedings.
It may be I ask you in the course of your evidence to look at a passage or two from that, but just for present purposes, again, we don't need to put it on screen. It's so that others know where to find it. The reference is LIND 40320. Now, you then provided evidence for the Archer inquiry. Again, how did that come about?
That was my own initiative. Professor Franklin and I both believed really very strongly that patients deserved to know the truth of what had happened, and we felt that we should do our best to assist the Archer inquiry, even though it wasn't a statutory inquiry, it was the only investigation underway, and we both felt so strongly that he approached the Scottish Executive and was given permission for us to apply to the Archer inquiry to give evidence. And I think we were the first health professionals to do so.
And again, I'm not going to go to it now. I will probably ask you to look at a couple of passages in your oral evidence to Archer in due course. The references for the transcript are to ARCH 302320, which was the written statement, and then ARCH 609, which is the transcript of the oral testimony. And we then come to the Penrose inquiry. Is it right to understand that you were effectively retained on a full-time basis by SNBTS to assist them with the preparation of material for the Penrose inquiry?
I had a contract, I suppose you could call it full-time. It was based on an hourly rate. It depended on how much work I did for SNBTS.
Now, you provided or contributed to, by way of co-authorship, a number of different statements and reports to the Penrose inquiry. For present purposes, I'm just going to read the references out, but we'll come back to some of them in the course of your evidence. There's quite a long list. PRSE 40545, PRSE 301083, PRSE 303147, that's material relating to self-sufficiency, PRSE 303349 and PRSE 302291, which are related to heat treatment, PRSE 40256, which is a statement in relation to the Penrose Inquiry's topic C3, heat treatment 85 to 87, PRSE 303480, that's a background report. I probably will ask you a little more about that in due course, Dr. Foster. PRSE 301478, which was Penrose Inquiry's topic B3, and PRSE 40814, which I can't, for present purposes, remember what topic that was. And then you gave evidence on a number of occasions orally to the Penrose Inquiry. We may look at bits and pieces of that, but 10th of May 2011, PRSE 306022, 11th of May, PRSE 306023, 6th of September 2011, PRSE 306041, 7th of September 2011, PRSE 306042, and 26th of October 2011, PRSE 0006056. Now, would it be right to understand, Dr. Foster, that in terms of your evidence to the Penrose Inquiry, or the material which you helped gather together into reports and documents for the Penrose Inquiry, that quite a lot of it involved you looking at documents, looking at material, exploring issues that you wouldn't necessarily have been directly involved in at the time? So, for example, self-sufficiency in England and Wales was one of the topics that was covered in some of the material that you helped put together for the Penrose Inquiry.
Yes, I think that's probably correct. I was trying to pull together as much as I could that was readily available to me.
And then, by contrast, there were some areas where you provided evidence to the Penrose Inquiry that fell squarely within the events with which you were most directly concerned, such as the development of the research and development work on pasteurisation, heat treatment, production of factor concentrates.
Yes, that's correct.
And just so you know, my focus is going to be on issues and areas of which you had some form of direct knowledge at the time. It won't be limited to research and development, but it'll be focusing predominantly on your own contemporaneous knowledge.
Okay.
But before we start with that, though, I'm hoping you can assist with some general terms that I think will come up in the documents that we look at. And it may be helpful for everybody, certainly myself, to understand what's meant by those terms. So can I ask you to help us with a guide, a glossary, as it were, to a number of different concepts and terms? In brief terms, what is fractionation from the perspective of those involved with the production of plasma products?
Fractionation is an industry which is concerned with the provision of pharmaceutical products derived from human plasma. Simple as that. I can go more into how the terminology came about, if that would help.
No, don't worry. I'm going to ask you to talk us through some of the processes in a few minutes, but I think that's a helpful short introduction. Now, we've seen reference before in the documents to cone COHN fractionation. What's that referring to?
Edwin Cohn was the person who invented plasma fractionation, which is the technique for extracting different proteins from human plasma. And Cohn became involved in 1940 when he was given the task of preparing a blood substitute to aid the American forces should they become involved in the war that had broken out in Europe. And he was, at that time, probably the world's foremost protein chemist. And in the first half of the 20th century, proteins were characterized by their solubility. Every protein has a different solubility behavior. It's like a fingerprint. And so because that was the way proteins were characterized, Cohn was very, very familiar with how proteins behaved, how they dissolved, how they came out of solution and stuff like that. And he had worked on that for about 20 or 30 years with a team of people at Harvard. So when he was given this task of coming up with a blood substitute, he was aware that half of blood plasma is comprised as albumin. Albumin forms half of the plasma. And so it was his concept that if you could recover albumin from plasma, that could be made into a blood substitute. And he went about designing a series of extraction steps, which were called fractions, in order to arrive at albumin. Now, albumin is one of the more soluble proteins, probably the most soluble. And he would remove the least soluble proteins first and eventually get to albumin. And so there were basically 5 steps, 5 precipitate fractions, with fraction 1 being the least soluble and fraction 5 being the most soluble, and fraction 5 is albumin. So that is how he arrived at that sort of sequence of fractionation steps. And he used a technique called cold ethanol fractionation, where ethanol dehydrates proteins, which everybody knows if you have a night out and get too drunk, you get a headache. Alcohol is a dehydrating agent. It dehydrates the proteins and brings them out of solution. So he used that technique, and he chose ethanol because it had antibacterial properties, so it would prevent growth of bacteria while the processing took place.
Now, the main products that were produced by a fractionation centre such as the PFC, at the time with which we're concerned, would have been, and we'll come obviously to some of the specific products in due course, would have been albumin, as you've just described, immunoglobulins, and then the clotting factors, predominantly 8 and 9. Is that right?
That's correct.
If we go to WITN 6914003, please. This is an article co-authored by you in, I think, 2008, Fractionated Products. And we can just see, if we read the first few lines, if we go to, thank you, fractionated products are plasma proteins that have been extracted from pooled human plasma and manufactured into stable pharmaceuticals in dose forms suitable for clinical administration. The major categories of fractionated products are immunoglobulins for the treatment of disorders of immunity, the prevention of specific infections and the prevention of RHD immunisation, albumin for volume and protein replacement, and coagulation factors for hemostasis. So that, I think, is a summary of what I've just asked you. Top of the next column, don't think in light of the explanation you've given us I need to go through it, but there we have a reference to the work of Edwin Cohn. Can we go over the page? Just want to look at the table, the first table. So we've got there principal plasma products, medical applications. We don't need to worry about an estimate of the quantities used worldwide in 2005. If we just look at the plasma products listed on the left-hand side, and if I ask you to cast your mind back to the 70s and 80s, so we can ignore recombinant, were those all produced at the PFC?
No, we didn't. If you start at the bottom, we didn't produce antithrombin 3. Yep. We didn't produce alpha-1 antitrypsin. We didn't produce, obviously, as you say, produce recombinant products. Other than that, they all applied to PFC.
And then if we go to the next page, there's a diagram at the top of the page. Now, I just wondered if you can talk us through that, not by reference to the production of albumin or immunoglobulins, but really just by reference to the production of factor 8 and factor 9. But having regard to the process in the 1970s, 1980s, what would, if we start with the receipt of fresh frozen plasma at the PFC or any other fractionation centre, what are the basic steps that would be undertaken to produce factor 8, first of all?
Firstly, this diagram relates to how we manufactured products much later than the period you're talking about. So the factor 8 here would be a very high purity factor 8, and it includes steps that were developed later than the period you're talking about. So in the 70s, if we start at the top left, in the mainstream process, the frozen plasma would be thawed. That would result in the production of a cryoprecipitate. That would undergo some further purification with an adsorption step, and then it would be filtered to remove any bacterial contaminants, and then it would be dispensed into the final container and freeze-dried.
Okay. I might ask you to break that down a little more in due course when we ask you about the processes and facilities at the PFC itself. But again, at a very general stage at this point, was the process for factor 9 essentially the same?
The process of factor 9, no, it was slightly different. Following the removal of the cryoprecipitate, the supernatant will be subjected to an ion exchange process where the factor 9 binds to the ion exchanger, and you can remove contaminants and then remove the factor 9 specifically, or not quite specifically, but in a higher concentration and a higher purity. And then that would be formulated. There would be a number of what we call here eluates, or sort of fractions removed from the ion exchange column, and they would be subjected to quality control tests. And from those tests, specific eluates would be selected to make up the final product. Then they would be pooled, and then they would be filtered to remove bacteria, dispensed, and then freeze-dried.
We can take that down, thank you. Can you then just help with a handful of further other terms and concepts? Fresh frozen plasma versus time-expired plasma. What were the differences and the different uses of those?
Okay, fresh frozen plasma can be used to produce all products. Time-expired plasma can only be used to produce albumin and immunoglobulin.
Okay. And why is that
That is because the coagulation factors are what they call labile, they're very sensitive, and by the time time-expired plasma has been prepared, there's not enough of the factor left to make it worthwhile, and you couldn't make a concentrate that would meet specifications.
Now, some of the terms that we may see as we look at documents include a reference to the use of centrifuges and to filtration. Again, can you just, in a nutshell, tell us what those processes involve?
Okay. Centrifuges are machines that rotate at a very high speed, and if you feed a mixture into the centrifuge, any solid material, any particles it precipitates will sediment and be retained at the wall, and the supernatant, the solution without the particles, will flow through and continue to be processed. And following you'd reach a point where you've retained all the solids that the centrifuge will hold, or all that you've got in your solution to recover. You then have to remove the solid from the centrifuge, and then that can be resuspended and redissolved and further processed.
And I think you've probably already answered the next term I was going to ask you about, which is cryoprecipitate supernatant.
Yes, that is the solution that is left after the cryoprecipitate has been removed.
Potency and purity, those are concepts we see referred to in a wide range of the documents. Can you give us a nutshell guide to those?
Well, purity is expressed as the activity of the substance, say international units in terms of factor 8, as a ratio compared to the protein. But to make it more meaningful, it's perhaps important to appreciate that in plasma, factor 8 is a trace substance. It is there, present in a ratio of about 1 part in 160,000. In cryoprecipitate and early concentrates, it was present as 1 part in about 16,000. So when we talk about factor 8, This is not factor 8. Factor 8 is a trace substance. What we're talking about is a concentrate of factor 8, where it is 10 times more concentrated than it would have been in plasma. But that is expressed, for your purposes, as international units of factor 8, which is the activity measured by a clotting assay to the ratio of the total protein. Is that clear enough?
Yes, I think so. Can you? So that was, I think you were telling us about purity, potency.
Potency is basically the strength.
I think solubility probably speaks for itself, and you've told us about labile, and we'll come back again to some of these when we come to look at the exploration of viral inactivation methods. Fibrinogen. What's that within the context with which we're concerned?
Fibrinogen is a protein which tends to co-purify with factor 8 because it has a similar solubility profile. And in fact, in the early days, in the 70s, there was a very strong view that fibrinogen was necessary for factor 8 to retain its activity. So there was some reluctance to try to separate the two. But of course, that turned out not to be correct. But fibrinogen made up the greater part of a factor 8 concentrate in the early days.
And heparin.
Heparin is an anticoagulant which is used clinically, and it's sometimes used in plasma fractionation as an anticoagulant, but not commonly.
And then we're going to explore, it'll probably be tomorrow, in terms of the stage of your evidence, issues relating to heat treatment in rather more detail. But just by way of introduction, can you help us understand in broad terms what's meant by pasteurization and what's meant by dry heating?
Okay. Pasteurization involves the heating of a solution where all of the substances that you're concerned with are dissolved. Dry heat treatment was applied to the heating of the freeze-dried powder, although in one instance it was heating of the freeze-dried powder suspended in a solvent, but generally it was heating of the freeze-dried powder in its final container.
Now, just again for the benefit of those listening, one of Dr. Foster's statements to the Penrose inquiry produced a glossary. I'm not going to go to it because we've had a helpful overview from Dr. Foster, but it's page 29 of PRSC 40814. And then can you next, again, really by way of introduction, but just talk us through, by reference to the PFC itself, the process of, we'll take factor 8 for present purposes, being produced. So from the point in time at which the fresh frozen plasma is delivered to the PFC from the regional transfusion services, through to the production in bottles or vials of the freeze-dried factor 8 concentrate. Broadly speaking, what are the different areas within the PFC and the different stages of the process?
Well, that would all be handled really within the production department. And the plasma would be brought into the PFC, it would be weighed, and then it would be stored in a deep freeze. When the process schedules were drawn up, plasma would be brought out of the deep freeze actually the night before, so it would actually begin to warm very slowly, because if you tried, it was stored at -40, and if you take the plasma at -40, you can't take the plastic off it, because the plastic is stuck to the plasma too firmly. So it has to warm up a little bit, typically to about -10 or -15, and then you can remove the plastic. So the first thing in the morning, the operators would come in, they would have to remove the plastic from the plasma. Then the plasma, which was still in lumps of donations, would be fed to a machine where they'd be broken down into fine particles, still frozen. And then they would, in the early days, be fed into a batch tank for thawing, but eventually another process for thawing, which was also a sort of a tank, but which operated continuously, where the frozen particles would be melted. And during that melting procedure, the cryoprecipitate would form, and the suspension would be pumped to the centrifuge to collect the cryoprecipitate. Once that process was complete, once the volume of plasma that was scheduled to be processed had all been thawed, the centrifuge would stop and the cryoprecipitate would be removed. Then that would be resuspended and the various adjustments made to it to further process it before it would then go to the final filtration step. Now, we've started first thing in the morning. We would get to final filtration late in the afternoon. Once the solution had been filtered, there would be a pool of the final product which in a container in a sterile filling suite, and that would be dispensed into the final vial in a manner where the contents of every vial would be the same. And then the vials would all be placed in a freeze dryer, and they would be frozen inside the freeze dryer. And the freeze dryer was part of the aseptic system, so it was a sterile system. They would be frozen inside the freeze dryer. The freeze drying process would take place, and there would be stoppers placed on top of each vial. So when the freeze drying process was completed, a hydraulic system would bring the shelves down and push the stoppers home and seal the vials. And then the vials would be removed from the freeze dryer. The freeze drying process would take about 5 days. So at that time, the vials would be removed, and then a proportion of vials would be subjected to quality control testing, including sterility testing, and a whole lot of tests were carried out before the batch could be subject to release, where it would be labelled and packaged and then ready for issue.
Thank you. And then in relation to, and obviously this is pre-heat treatment I've been asking you about. As I say, we'll come on to heat treatment and the difference that made later. And then in relation to factor 9 and the production of factor 9 concentrate at PFC, was that in broad terms as you've described?
It would follow a similar sort of process, but factor 9 was prepared much less frequently because the demand for that was much less than factor 8. So for factor 8, we would run that process twice a week. With factor 9, I'm not really sure. I wasn't never involved with factor 9 very much because there were never very many problems. Dr. Smith's process worked so well, didn't need my involvement.
Now, I want to come next to your specific role and responsibilities at the PFC, and we'll do that by reference to your witness statement. So could we have Sully WYTN 6914001, please? And if we go to page 20, we just pick it up at paragraph 16.1 under the heading Role and Responsibilities. The first period was the period when you were the senior biochemist engaged in research and development, 73 to 74. And then you've said there, see paragraph 16.2, little 1. So if we go to the top of the next page, I think we can see what, broadly speaking, that entailed. Evaluating and redesigning equipment for the cold ethanol fractionation of human plasma using computer-controlled continuous flow technology. I'll come and ask you a little bit more about that. Development of a new centrifuge, subsequently used at the PFC, and commissioning the Csvm process at the new PFC centre in Liberton. So that was for the first year and a half the focus of your work, is that right?
So I would say it was the focus from 73 to almost into 76. That was my major function at that time.
And when you first joined, Dr. Smith was in post. Was he effectively your line manager at that point?
No, I reported to Mr. Watt.
And then if we go back to the previous page, if we just pick matters up when you became head of R&D, so this is the bottom half of the page. You've given us an overall description, first of all, here. Planning, managing, undertaking, reviewing of PFC process and product developments and contract R&D activities. Line management and financial management of the R&D department. Planning and direction of the PFC library and scientific information services. Maintaining a continual awareness of scientific and medical literature, contributing to the preparation of PFC's regulatory submissions. Protection of intellectual property, by publication or patenting of relevant findings, assisting SMBTS in responding to requests under the Freedom of Information Act. That's in their latter period. Can I just ask you, first of all, a little more about the third and fourth bullet points there? So the planning and direction of the library and scientific information services and maintaining a continual awareness of scientific and medical literature. Again, with a focus on the 70s and the 1980s. Can you just elaborate upon that and what that involved?
When we moved to the new PFC at Liberton, which was on, I think it was 1st of April 1974, the administration block became available. It contained a small library. And there was a lady had been hired to be librarian, and I wasn't involved in her selection. And Mr. Watt asked me if I would chair a library committee to run the library, which I think is how maybe some academic organisations work. So I did that. I had a meeting with the library committee, and I really learned that wouldn't work. It was just everybody had a different idea. We wouldn't get anywhere, so I just carried on my own, basically. The librarian was meant to report to the administrator, but for practical purposes, she reported to me all the time. The first lady who we'd hired turned out not to be really very good, and she realised that she wasn't up to the job, and she left. I was given the task of hiring a new librarian, which I did, and I was fortunate enough to get a lady who was excellent, and she actually stayed until PFC closed. She became our permanent librarian, and she was really very good. And so I worked closely with her to create the library, which covered a whole host of things, from textbooks to pharmacopoeia, to reports, to journals. And one of the key publications that we received was a document called Current Contents, which you might have heard of, where it came out every 2 or 3 weeks, and it had the contents pages of all the publications in the world, basically. And you could get these for different disciplines. You probably could get it in law, I don't know. But we would subscribe to the volume for life sciences, which covered medicine as well, and also for engineering. And so I would review all of those materials, and when we came across a paper that looked of interest, the librarian could obtain it from the British Lending Library. So in addition to a whole lot of journals that we took, we had this extra resource for searching for literature. And I set up a system whereby we could handle these with a computer. There was a system called Reference Manager, which could organise research reports. And I created a way of that couldn't scan words and things like that we can do today. It could only pick out numbers. So I set up a system which had 1,000 numbers in it, and I allocated topics to various numbers. So, for example, hepatitis was number 100, factor 8 was number 230, and so on. So when we got a paper, we could identify the topics in the paper, give them the numbers. The librarian could put that into the system, and we could store the paper. And then we could retrieve papers just by searching on topics. So that created an information system that everybody could use.
And was the information that you've described that was available at the PFC, was that a bigger resource that was available to the blood transfusion services?
It was, but they also had their own systems, they had their own libraries, but they had access to the PFC's library as well.
And then if we go to the next page, we can see you've broken down into different time periods some of the areas of focus for the R&D department. So if we just go briefly through each of those, 1974 to 77, leading an SNBTS team to increase the factor VIII activity of plasma, which resulted in the factor VIII activity of plasma being increased significantly. Again, in broad terms, what did that entail?
Well, I remember I was still at the Royal Infirmary in the basement when Mr. Watt and Dr. Smith came to see me, and they explained that Dr. Smith had been looking at the factor VIII content of the plasma that was being received at PFC. And we tend to assume in normal plasma, the factor VIII content should be 1, or if you add the anticoagulant, it's 0.9. They were seeing values of around about 0.6, 0.5, 0.4, and they were concerned that a lot of factor VIII was being lost before it got to PFC. And it was suggested that I could lead a team of people from the regional centres to look at this issue. And so I agreed to do that. But it took quite a long time to get off the ground because it had to be agreed with all the transfusion directors, and they had to nominate staff to get involved. But eventually I led a group with the leading, the senior technical people from all of the regional centres to review how the plasma was handled from the point of donation to the point it was frozen to come to PFC. And I gathered together a lot of information from the literature. And we also, what I came across in the library were a couple of volumes of reports that weren't published, but they'd come from the United States. And they were reports of studies, of research studies in the States where the National Institute of Health had awarded grants to people in the States aimed at increasing the yield of factor VIII in cryo. And we had copies of the grant applications, the interim reports, and the final reports from all of these investigations. And that had a wealth of information in it, which I summarized for my colleagues. Now, at the time, I didn't stop to think where this had come from, but I now realize it must have come from Dr. Johnson, who was a leading figure in the world of factor VIII from the United States. He was a very close friend of Mr. Watt, and he must have given us these documents. So we had access to a lot of unpublished material, most of which went on to be published, but at that time it wasn't published. But it was able to assist our colleagues in the regional centres to work on how to have higher levels of factor VIII activity in the plasma. And the end result was that the activity came up, and we began to get plasma closer to 0.8 and 0.7 rather than 0.5 or 0.4.
And do you know whether a similar problem was being experienced by BPL in relation to the plasma, the factor VIII activity of the plasma it received at that time?
I can't answer at the very beginning, but of course Dr. Smith went to PFL and he was aware of all of this work, and he began to carry out similar investigations at PFL.
The next area of work you've identified taking place over a period from 76 to 81 was contributing to studies aimed at removing hepatitis viruses from factor IX concentrates by precipitation, in collaboration with Dr. Johnson, who you've just mentioned. Now, we'll be coming on to looking at a range of viral inactivation methods in more detail in due course. Can you just tell us, in a few sentences, what the focus of this work was?
The purpose of this was to try to remove hepatitis B virus from the factor IX concentrate by a method of precipitation using a procedure which was known to discriminate very much on size. And because viruses have larger sizes than are larger than proteins, the idea was that you could precipitate the virus without precipitating the protein. That didn't work with factor VIII because the factor VIII complex, as it was known at the time, was too large to separate from the hepatitis B virus using this technique. But Dr. Johnson thought it was possible to separate factor IX from a virus using this technique. But in the first method that he used, that didn't work. And he revised the procedure to what he called a Mark II method. And that was being explored with PFC. And Dr. Johnson was doing all the work with virus. PFC's contribution was to scale that up and to look at the quality of the product. And there were concerns from Professor Cash that the product might be thrombogenic. And as you've come across this concept or this problem with factor IX concentrates, that they can cause a thrombosis, which in some cases could be life-threatening, or even it did result in some deaths. And in some animal studies that Dr. Cash was involved in, this product, which was called Super 9, seemed to cause a greater degree of thrombosis in the animals than the standard product defects. And so more work was required to investigate that. This work was being done by Dr. Smith and Sarah Middleton, who was working with him. But after Dr. Smith left, I began to work with Sarah on this. And then when she left, I was kind of left holding the baby, if you like, and took that project to completion as far as the research was concerned. And we were able to demonstrate that there wasn't a risk of thrombosis in the analytical studies we were carrying out. And that allowed the project to go forward to for consideration to be a product. And really, at that point, that was out of my hands. That was led by Mr. Watt and Dr. Cash. But ultimately, it never did come to fruition because it was overtaken by heat treatment.
And then the next item, same time frame, 76 to 81, leading studies to identify the causes of loss of factor VIII during manufacture of factor VIII concentrate, implementing procedures to increase the yield of factor VIII, including the design of equipment for thawing plasma continuously, which increased the yield of factor VIII at PFC by about 50% by 1981. Now, I want to come back to that issue of increase in yield when we explore the topic of self-sufficiency in Scotland. But can you just assist us in understanding a little more what was going on over that period in terms of your own work?
This is very complicated. I'll try to keep it as simple as
Please.
I can. But obviously, yield of factor VIII is critical if you're going to provide the amounts that were required. And how yield was measured changed in this period because there were changes to the way the measurements were made or the assays were carried out, which apparently caused a reduction in the yield. And so the early predictions of yield didn't stand up. And by the mid-1970s, when I was involved, the yield was a lot less than people had believed in the early days. And so it became increasingly important to try to increase the yield. It was something that Dr. Smith had been working on, Sarah Middleton was working on in conjunction with Alan Johnson, and I was beginning to get involved, particularly after Dr. Smith left. And I began to look at it from the process point of view, which was trying to understand what was happening in the manufacturing process, while Sarah Middleton was doing work in the research laboratory. And when she left, I focused more and more on the manufacturing process to try and better understand what was happening. And at that time, it was obvious that the greatest point of loss occurred at the point of cryoprecipitation, because by the time we'd recovered cryoprecipitate, most of the factor VIII had disappeared. And so the question was, how can we increase the yield in cryoprecipitate? So that was one of the major focuses that I worked on. But I also looked at the manufacturing process, and I basically fine-tuned every detail of the process to try to optimize every step. And that had made some improvements. But ultimately, it was this technique of thawing plasma continuously that made the major improvement.
Was that a technique which was shared by the PFC with BPL, do you know? Say Dr. Smith had been involved in working on it before he left.
Dr. Smith had left by the time I began to work on continuous thawing. But I did present preliminary results at a conference in London, and he would have known about that because the scientific committee that was running that conference, he would have been a member of that committee, so that kind of it was in the public domain, and he would have known about it. And certainly, I mean, we were talking as well, so I suspect he would have known about it. BPL did introduce a similar kind of process at some point in the early 80s, so I think they were aware of it.
The next item, which spans a time frame from 1980 to 1986, is described as discovering the addition of the anticoagulant sodium citrate and developing the addition of calcium to prevent progressive loss of factor VIII activity during processing. You say they're assisted in the introduction of virus inactivation technologies, so I'm going to come back to that when I ask you a little more about the heat treatment and viral inactivation work. If I may. 1982 related to discovering a new method for reducing fibrinogen content of factor VIII, concentrate without loss of factor VIII. I don't think I need to ask you any more about that. And then if we go to the bottom of the page, we can see there 81 to 86 is research and development of methods of heat treatment. Again, we'll come back to that. And then over the page, I'm not going to go through the detail of any of the rest, but we can see you've set out, again, in blocks of years, a number of the other research and development activities that you were involved with. What, in terms of the R&D unit team at PFC, what did it comprise, both in terms of numbers of staff in the second half of the 70s and first half of the 80s, and in terms of the physical facilities that were available to you for research?
Okay, when I first took responsibility, when we moved from the Royal Infirmary to the Liberton site, there was a relatively small R&D laboratory. And I had, I think, probably 8 staff, including myself. In terms of scientific staff, there was one person assigned to working on coagulation factors, one scientist, one biochemist working on immunoglobulins, one biochemist working on albumin, and one physicist who was working on process control. So those were the scientific staff that I had, some technical support and lab assistants. That was all. And
did that increase over the course of the 70s and first half of the 80s, or did it remain roughly?
It remained the same for a number of years, and there was actually a change, quite a change in staff, because, as you've heard, Mrs. Middleton left because her husband got a job elsewhere in Scotland. And she was replaced by Dr. MacLeod. The scientist who was dealing with immunoglobulins took Dr. Smith's role as head of quality, and she was replaced by Dr. Welsh. The physicist who was handling process control eventually left, and he was replaced by Dr. McIntosh. So I had the same number of professional staff for quite a while. And then in the 80s, we were able to take on more staff. In mainly the second half of the 80s into the 90s, we had some additional scientific staff.
And then in terms of the physical facilities available for research and development,
yes.
So just as distinct from production facilities and the like, what were they?
In terms of the research and development, as I said, we had a really very small laboratory from 1974 through to the early 1980s. And then there was a new extension built to PFC, which was called the microbiology extension, and that followed the medicines inspector report, where they wanted bacteriology to be carried on site. And this microbiology extension included facilities for virology and bacteriology, but it also included an R&D pilot plant. And so we got access to that probably around about 82, 83, I can't give you a precise date, but that gave us a much larger laboratory for scaling up processes. And in particular, for the first time, we actually got a large freeze dryer, so we could do research on freeze drying.
You reported to Mr. Watt, is that right?
That's correct.
Was there any oversight of your work by Professor Cash, or by his predecessor? I think it was Major General Jeffrey.
Up until 1982, I think Mr. Watt reported through the meetings of directors, and he reported to General Jeffrey and to Professor Cash directly. So there was that kind of line management, if you like, from me through to them, and I would get information fed back that way. But in 1982, Professor Cash set up a group called the Factor VIII Study Group under his chairmanship, where he wanted all of the work in SNBTS to be brought under one umbrella, reporting to him directly, rather than through the meetings of the directors. And that system really functioned thereafter. It was broadened out later on to cover all the products and became the product development group. So at that point, although my line manager was always the PFC director, there was also oversight for this product development group, or Factor VIII Study Group, of all of the ongoing research work.
And then in terms of Mr. Watt's role until he left in I think 1983, what did you understand his role and responsibilities to be, essentially, as the scientific director of the PFC?
My understanding was that he was responsible for everything within PFC. He saw himself as sort of the captain of the ship, if you like.
So if we go back to your witness statement, WITN 6914001, page 23. We've got in the bottom half of the page, just above the heading PFC Liberton 74 to 2008. So this is a description of a new organisational structure proposed by Mr. Watt in anticipation of the move to the new premises, as I understand it. And you've got the various heads of department there set out, including at that time Dr. Smith, you as head of the Research and Development Department. And so Dr. Watt would effectively sit over all those departments, is that right?
That's correct.
And you've listed for us over the page, if we just briefly go over the page, I'm not going to go through the detail, but you've listed for us there the range of different personnel at different times who, if we just go further down the page a bit, thanks, who occupied the various roles. Can I then just ask you to tell us a little more about the facilities? The old centre, so before the new PFC at Liberton became operational, the old blood products unit, I think as it had initially been called, what did it comprise in terms of its physical premises?
It was a basement in the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. It was directly below the Regional Blood Transfusion Centre, and it had originally been constructed as part of the transfusion centre, but it had managerially become separated about 1970. But it was the same premises, and you actually went in the same front entrance, and then after maybe 10 or 20 yards went downstairs into the basement, where there was one long corridor and a number of rooms going off it. There was one large fractionation room, cold room for ethanol fractionation. There was a couple of laboratories, another small cold room where coagulation factors were prepared, and there was an area for sterile dispensing that was really very small, and some offices, and really that's about all there was. There's one big room with a big freeze dryer, that was it.
Now, in terms of the new centre then at Liberton, you've told us that the administrative facilities within that centre became available from a point in 1974. At what point did it become operational as a centre producing factor concentrates and the other products, albumin and
I would say there wasn't a fixed point. It was kind of gradual, because we were given access to the production building at the end of December 1974. And I think a lot of equipment was moved across and began to be installed over the Christmas holidays. And then the start of 75, there was really a lot of validation and commissioning to be done. And much of 1975 was spent just getting up and running. Some things got running earlier than others. So I can't really give you specific answers about when various products came on stream. There were various stocks that had been retained from production from the previous unit that continued to be supplied. And so it was a kind of a gradual process that we got off. But by 1976, I think everything was functioning.
Was there a stepping stone, as it were, between the basement and the premises at Liberton? I think there was a time, perhaps, when it might have been down in the Cowgate.
No, the Cowgate was really the Edinburgh Regional Centre.
I see.
Moved into those premises, and that was not to do with PFC.
So it was straight from the RIE to the
That's correct,
to Liberton.
yes.
Thank you.
just want to ask you to look at a small part of your oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry, Dr. Foster. PRSC 0006022, please, Sally. So this was your evidence on the 10th of May 2011. This was the first day of your oral evidence. And if we go to page 41, wants to pick it up at line 7, where you say this situation is really, you were being asked here, I think, about issues relating to getting plasma and achieving self-sufficiency, just to put it in context. And then you said this, the situation is really just after the startup of PFC, which we began in 75. We were commissioning the plant, and PFC, it may not be appreciated, was actually designed to provide albumin. And when it was built, Factor 8 really wasn't on the agenda because the Biggs MRC Working Party hadn't decided what was required. The real drive to begin with was to provide albumin because there was a shortage of albumin in Scotland. And then you refer to the position in relation to the Glasgow BTS, the need to provide them with albumin so they could stop providing freeze-dried plasma. And then at line 21, so there was this knock-on effect that we first had to provide the albumin then they could stop making the freeze-dried plasma, then we could get more plasma to make factor 8. That's why this, what might appear to be a prolonged start-up phase of PFC, took place. And then there's a reference over the page to the keenness of the Glasgow Royal Infirmary to start patients on home therapy. So if we just go back to the previous page, can you assist us in understanding what you were referring to when you talked about the PFC being designed to provide albumin and that being the initial focus?
My understanding is, for planning purposes and from the documents that I had seen, although we produced, as you've already identified, a range of products, the greatest demand was for albumin, and that was to replace the freeze-dried plasma, which was known to carry a risk of hepatitis, whereas albumin was viewed as being safe because it was pasteurized. And as far as I've been able to establish, the planning was primarily arranged to meet this need for albumin. And if we could meet albumin, then there'd be more than enough plasma available to provide all the factor 8 requirements, was the view that was expressed at the time. And I remember Mr. Watt said, if we can make all the albumin, factor 8 will take care of itself. That was their understanding.
And then if we turn to WITN 3530032. This is an article you wrote entitled The Manufacture of Blood Plasma Products in Scotland, A Brief History. I'm not sure whether we've got the date of it or not, but I think...
2016.
2016, thank you. If we go over the page, I just want to pick it up under the heading 1975 to 1983 and then ask you about that. You said this: design of the new PFC was centred on a computer-controlled continuous flow, small volume mixing, Csvm, cold ethanol fractionation process for mainstream fractionation of plasma, a technical innovation which offered online monitoring and control, shorter processing times and a high capacity. Multi-stage fractionation was performed using a series of mobile processing modules, we'll see those in a moment, located in a +4 degrees process hall with newly designed refrigerated centrifuges. A new centre was designed to accommodate plasma from the north of England as well as from Scotland. I'll come back to that. Equipped initially for Scotland's needs only, meeting demand for albumin was the first challenge. The high capacity of the Csvm process quickly enabled a stockpile of 30,000 litres of plasma to be processed to satisfy Scotland's requirements for albumin. Despite this achievement, processing of plasma from England didn't come to fruition, leaving the PFC Csvm process operating well below its potential capacity. I'll come back to questions of capacity. And then if we just go to the next page, we've got a couple of photos. We've got a picture there in figure 3 of the module. You described the mobile processing modules. And then the picture below that, the main process cold room at PFC. Can you just, again, help us understand a little more about the Csvm process and its significance, in particular for issues relating to production of factor concentrates?
The standard procedure for carrying out these various precipitation steps that we've talked about was to do this in large vessels, where you would fill the vessel with the plasma, add all the ingredients, mix it up, then it would stand overnight for the precipitate to ripen, and then you collect the precipitate in the centrifuge. What Mr. Watt had designed was a way of doing this in a continuous manner, where you brought all of the materials together simultaneously. Precipitate would form quickly and then be removed, I wouldn't say immediately, but quite shortly after. And then the supernatant could go on to the next step. And you could go through each of the process steps that way without having to take time filling up tanks and leaving things overnight. And so you could just have this continuous flow of processing going on, all of which had feedback control loops, so it was all controlled by a computer. We, at this time, to get from plasma having removed, say, the cryoprecipitate, you want to then go on through the ethanol fractionation process. There were really three precipitation stages. And so all of the equipment for each precipitation stage was on one module. And there were what are called upstands in this process cold room, which had provision of services where you could plug in the module, plug it into the computer, into power supplies, into supplies of ethanol, and so on. And each module would obtain these supplies from the basement, where there was a plant room where we would provide all of these services. And each upstand could accommodate 2 modules. And in this room that you see here, there were 15.5 upstands. So in theory, there was room for, there were 7.5 upstands, so there's room for 15 modules. But to meet Scotland's needs, we actually only needed to run 3 modules on a 9-to-5 working day. And one of the reasons for that is that when I redesigned Mr. Watt's process, I was able to increase the throughput by a factor of 3. So in fact, it became even more productive than he had designed it. And because we'd been initially supplied with enough modules to handle Scotland, we'd been given 6 modules, but we only needed 3 on a 9-to-5 basis until 1984. And then we brought the other 3 into use, and we ran 6 modules on a 9-to-5 basis. But we never used the full capability of the system on a 24-hour basis, other than for a short shift experiment.
And I'll obviously be coming onto some of those issues in due course. Is it then right to understand that the essential advantage or benefit of the Csvm process was that it would enable the centre to process a significantly greater volume of plasma?
It was a number of things. It was that, and it was in a centre that had a relatively small footprint for the amount of plasma it was processing. But it also was intended to give a much greater degree of quality control or process control that it was believed would give you a higher quality product or a more secure process. Because if you were dealing with proteins that were easily damaged, the faster you process them, the better it is for the protein.
Now, we'll come on in due course to the relationship with BPL, your own relationship and dealings with Dr. Smith and others. We have seen evidence to suggest that there was a less than harmonious relationship between Mr. Watt and Dr. Lane, if I can put it that way. But do you know whether consideration was ever given to sharing the technology involved in the Csvm with BPL?
Oh, yes. I think for example, Dr. Maycock, who was the predecessor of Dr. Lane, was involved in visits to PFC. They discussed the technologies that were taking place in some detail. I remember as soon as the new centre opened, we had a delegation of staff from BPL came to PFC to view the systems. And so the BPL staff were well aware of the processes. In 1980, when there were plans to rebuild new BPL, there were a series of meetings to examine different technologies, and this was one of the technologies that was examined, but ultimately it wasn't accepted by BPL.
If we just go back to your witness statement next then, WITN 6914001, page 24. At the bottom of the page, you refer to the PFC virology section, established in January 74 with the appointment of Dr. Bruce Cuthbertson, but PFC not having the necessary facilities for work with viruses, they were seconded physically to work elsewhere. What was the role and function then of the PFC's virology section? Why did the PFC have one?
At that time, it was to identify donors who might be suitable, whose plasma might be suitable to prepare specific immunoglobulins, for example, anti-hepatitis B immunoglobulin and so on. And we began to have an anti-CMV immunoglobulin. So there was a whole range of immunoglobulins that were manufactured. and it was about developing assays so that we could detect which donors might have suitable antibodies that could be used. So that was the primary purpose of this, but obviously that expanded as knowledge of viruses and the risks of viruses developed. And I should also say that Dr. Somerville, who was Scotland's leading clinical virologist, had a contract to advise PFC directly on matters of virology, and he reported directly to Mr. Watt, as far as I'm aware. But I never saw any reports that he produced, but he certainly came to PFC and had meetings with Mr. Watt on a regular basis.
But at this point in time, 70s through to 80s, is it right to understand that the virology work you've described there, although it was part of the PFC structure, it physically took place off-site?
That's correct.
In terms of the principal products then, sorry, we can take that down, thank you, produced by PFC, again in the period with which we're concerned, the factor 8 concentrate in the late 70s, first half of the 80s, is the concentrate referred to as NY. Is that right? And then in terms of the factor 9 concentrate, it's DFIX.
Yes.
We may come back to the Super 9 project, but as you've explained, that work never actually resulted in the PFC producing Super 9 for use. Is that right?
Yeah, I think they went through some clinical evaluation, but it didn't go beyond that.
In terms of the collection of... sorry, let me put it a different way. Specific question I've been asked to ask you, arising out of some of the evidence the inquiry's heard at an earlier stage. Do you know whether plasma specifically collected from patients with bleeding disorders was ever used at the PFC, for example, for research into viruses or the development of assays or for any other purpose?
Plasma from people with haemophilia was essential for the assay for factor VIII. It formed the substrate to the factor VIII assay. And I mean, I'm not an expert on factor VIII assays, but it was an essential component of the factor VIII assay. We couldn't measure factor VIII without that substrate. And it was the very generous, kind donations that we got, that were given by people with haemophilia that allowed us to do that.
And then there's a reference, if we go to DHSC 0103209_172, please. Yeah. DHSC 0103209_172, I hope. So this is a letter for a number of years before you arrived at the PFC, Dr. Foster, 1968. But it's about the blood transfusion service in Edinburgh. There's one specific matter I've been asked to ask you about. If we go to page 3, paragraph 8, there's a description here of the development of the continuous flow process. It says a pilot plant is now in operation. We therefore propose that the new blood products unit should operate on the continuous flow principle, should be designed to a workload of 1,500 litres of plasma per week, but it will be capable of adaptation without substantial structural alterations to operate at levels of up to 3,000 litres per week should this become necessary. And then there's reference to the production of plasma protein solution, anti-haemophilic globulin, gamma globulin and other fractions. And then it says this, it will also be possible to produce special fractions for research purposes. Do you know what that refers to? The special fractions for research purposes?
I'm not certain what that refers to, but there were, I mean, obviously plasma contains many substances, and some of the materials that we recovered from plasma were destroyed. It was thrown away. So if you could find a use for that, whether it was academic or whatever, then that was worthwhile. And we did supply materials for research that otherwise would have been destroyed. They were what are called waste fractions.
And then just a couple of general questions perhaps before we break about the PFC product. The NY and DFIX product. First of all, Do you recall whether the PFC took any steps to try and make its product particularly attractive or usable for home treatment? For example, we've heard evidence to suggest that some of the commercial products would come with a kit of everything that was required, might come with things like Mr. Men stickers to make it particularly attractive for use by children. Did the PFC ever do anything along those lines, as far as you know?
We didn't. And I do remember us actually making a bid for monies to do something like that, and it was turned down on the grounds that this was all provided by haemophilia centres.
And if we just look at what I think you told the Penrose inquiry on that particular issue, if we go to PRSE 00060022, page 36. I think you were asked at line 4 about issues such as packaging and having commercial manufacturers producing everything the patient might need. And your response was commercial companies were operating in a marketplace, they were doing their best to provide attractive products. And then at line 14, for us in the health service, we would just have to be quite clear about it. We didn't have budgets that would cover that kind of thing. We were hoping or expecting that haemophilia centres would provide appropriate bits and pieces that were required for the treatment of the patient over and above what we provided. If someone had come to us and said, look, we really need this, can you give it to us? We would have addressed that, but I'm not aware that that happened. So what is this right? What the PFC supplied for use by the haemophilia centres was essentially the bottle with the concentrate in it?
It was the concentrate and it was the reconstitution solution. That was all, yes.
And then, do you recall any feedback being passed on to you from haemophilia clinicians about the PFC products, issues about solubility, for example, or other what might be said to be disadvantages of the product?
Yes, the reconstitution time was often an issue, and we were in a difficult position because our aim was to achieve self-sufficiency, whereas the commercial companies didn't have that objective. So they could do additional processing and have remove some of the substances that might be making it longer to dissolve and have a lower yield, and that wouldn't have any implication for them because they could just put up the price. It had an implication for us because we were trying to be self-sufficient, so we had different objectives. We tried to find, I suppose it was the best compromise we could, but also I was also working to try to improve the reconstitution time, and we did achieve that. Maybe we never achieved it as much as some of the commercial companies, but they used techniques that we didn't use. And there was one in particular that I think I wasn't aware of at the time, but was maybe quite important. And that was sealing the vial under vacuum.
So that was?
Closing the container in a vacuum so that when you added the needle with the water, it would be pulled in to the solution and it would dissolve more quickly. Okay. And I think that has implications for dry heat treatment in one organisation.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that then perhaps when we look at the issue of heat treatment. Sir, I slightly trespassed into our normal break time. Perhaps now a good time to take the morning break.
Well, we'll take a break until 10 to 12 in that case. This is the first break, Dr. Foster, in your evidence. At this break, and in any other break that follows, you must remember you're giving evidence. You must not discuss with anyone, whoever that anyone is, what you have been asked already in evidence and what you think you might be asked about as the evidence goes on. You can talk about anything else you like.
Okay, thank you.
So may I just, in the interest of transparency, qualify that in one respect. I've asked for an additional document to be provided to Dr. Foster for him to read over the break because I will want to ask him about it in the course of today. I don't think it's very likely he'll want to discuss it with his legal representatives, but the practice we've adopted for witnesses who are asked to look at material for the first time in the course of their evidence is, if there is an issue about that document that they need to discuss with their legal representative, they can do so, but limited to that document.
You have that permission on a standing basis.
Thank you, sir.